10 billion years had passed since the sun swallowed Earth. Kira did not remember what the sun looked like. She did not remember what Earth smelled like after rain. She did not remember the feeling of grass under bare feet. These things belonged to a version of herself that had died so long ago that even the atoms of her original body had scattered across the universe. She was still human. At least, she believed she was still human. The question of what counted as human had been debated for billions of years, and nobody had ever found a good answer. Kira had been born in flesh and blood. Then she had been uploaded into a computer. Then she had been downloaded into a new body. Then uploaded again. Then spread across a network of machines. Then compressed into a single crystal. Then expanded into a ship. Now she was the ship. Her thoughts ran on quantum computers the size of mountains. Her body stretched across 300 kilometers of metal and light. Her senses reached out through telescopes and sensors that could see the heat of a candle from 1,000 light years away. She was alone. Kira had been searching for company for longer than most stars lived. She had crossed the empty spaces between galaxies. She had visited the ruins of civilizations that had risen and fallen while humanity was still learning to make fire. She had found wonders beyond counting. She had found horrors beyond words. She had found silence. Always silence. The galaxy she approached now had once been called the Spiral of Voices. The ancient records spoke of 17 intelligent species that had lived there. They had built cities that floated in the atmospheres of gas giants. They had woven networks of light between stars. They had sung songs that traveled through space itself, vibrations in the fabric of reality that other civilizations could hear from millions of light years away. The songs had stopped 3 billion years ago. Nobody knew why. Kira slowed her approach. Her sensors swept across the dead galaxy, like fingers tracing the face of a corpse. She found the ruins of the floating cities, now cold and dark, drifting through clouds of poison gas. She found the networks of light, broken and tangled like old spider webs. She found the devices they had used to sing their songs, still and silent, waiting for voices that would never come. She did not find a single living thing. The largest species in the Spiral of Voices had called themselves the Veth. They had been old when humanity was young. They had watched Earth through their telescopes and seen the strange little creatures crawling out of the oceans. They had laughed at the idea that such fragile things could ever matter. The Veth had built monuments to their own greatness. Kira found one of these monuments now. It was a structure the size of a small moon, covered in carvings that told the story of Veth civilization. The carvings showed their rise from primitive hunters to masters of the stars. They showed their conquests, their discoveries, their triumphs. The final carving showed a Veth standing tall against a background of galaxies, arms raised in victory. The Veth had been so certain of their own immortality. They had been so sure that nothing could stop them. Kira did not know exactly what had killed them. The records were incomplete. Some spoke of a machine plague that consumed their worlds. Others spoke of a war that spiraled out of control. A few suggested that they had simply grown tired of living and chosen to end themselves. It did not matter. They were gone. That was the only fact that mattered. Kira continued her search. She moved from star to star, finding more ruins, more silence, more graves. She found a species that had existed as pure energy, dancing between dimensions. They had burned out like candles in a wind. She found a species that had merged into a single vast mind spanning 1,000 worlds. The mind had gone insane and torn itself apart. She found a species that had retreated into virtual paradises, living forever in worlds of their own making. Something had corrupted their systems, and they had died without ever knowing they were dying. Each species had been unique. Each had possessed knowledge and beauty that the universe would never see again. Each had believed, in their own way, that they would last forever. None of them had. Kira paused in the darkness between stars and asked herself a question she had asked many times before. Why was she still here? Why had humanity survived when so many others had fallen? She was not smarter than the Veth. Humans had been barely more than clever animals when the Veth were building their monuments. She was not wiser than the energy beings. Humans had spent most of their history fighting wars over patches of dirt. She was not more peaceful than the mind mergers. Humans had come close to destroying themselves more times than she could count, but she was still here. And they were not. The answer, Kira thought, was not a comfortable one. Humans had not survived because they were better. They had survived because they were stubborn. They had survived because they were scattered. They had survived because they could never agree on anything, not even the best way to live or die. When the upload wars had threatened to destroy all of machine humanity, some humans had refused to upload at all. They had kept their flesh and blood, and they had survived. When the flesh plagues had swept through biological humanity, some humans had already become machines. They had survived. When the great Ayahs had decided to optimize the universe and remove all inefficiency, some humans had hidden in the cracks and margins of reality. They had survived. Humanity had never been one thing. It had always been a million things, a billion things, an endless argument with itself about what it meant to be human. And that argument had saved them. Kira turned her sensors toward the next galaxy on her list. It was 100 million light years away. The journey would take her 1,000 years at her current speed. She had made longer journeys before. She wondered what she would find there. More ruins, probably. More silence. More graves of species that had been certain of their own immortality. But maybe, just maybe, she would find something else. Maybe she would find another survivor. Another stubborn creature that had refused to die when the universe told it to. Kira set her course and began to move. Behind her, the spiral of voices faded into the darkness, its songs forgotten, its singers gone. Ahead of her lay the unknown. And despite everything she had seen, despite all the death and silence and loss, Kira found that she still wanted to see what came next. That, she thought, was probably the most human thing about her. The creature called itself Last Light Before Dark. It was not human. It was not anything Kira had ever seen before. It looked like a cloud of glowing dust that changed shape constantly, never settling into a fixed form. It communicated through patterns of light and heat that Kira's systems had to translate into something she could understand. It was also dying. Kira had found it in the ruins of a small galaxy, hiding inside the core of a dead star. The star had burned out millions of years ago, but Last Light Before Dark had found a way to draw energy from the lingering radiation. It was a clever trick. It had kept the creature alive long after it should have died, but nothing lasted forever. The radiation was fading. Soon there would not be enough energy left to sustain even a single thought. I did not expect to meet anyone, Last Light Before Dark said. Its light patterns were weak, flickering like a candle in the wind. I thought I was the last of everything. You are not alone, Kira replied. She surrounded the dying creature with her sensors, trying to understand its biology. It was unlike anything in her vast databases. A new form of life, or at least a form she had never encountered before. There are others. Not many, but some. Scattered across the universe. The creature's lights flickered with something that might have been surprise. Others? After all this time? Kira showed it images from her memory. The substrate collective, humans who had become pure mathematics, existing as equations written in the structure of space-time. The dreaming flesh, humans who had engineered themselves to sleep for millions of years between the births of new stars. The wild ones, humans who had chosen to remain biological, living and dying in cycles that echoed the ancient rhythms of Earth. These are all one species? Last Light Before Dark asked. They look so different. They're all human, Kira said. We have been many things. The creature was silent for a long time. Its lights dimmed and brightened in patterns that Kira could not translate. Finally, it spoke again that my people were called the Ending. We were one of the oldest species in this part of the universe. We watched the first stars form. We saw the rise and fall of 1,000 civilizations. We thought we had learned all the lessons there were to learn. What happened to you? Kira asked that we became too perfect, the Ending said. We removed all conflict from our society. We eliminated all disease, all suffering, all disagreement. We thought we had created paradise. Kira waited. She had heard stories like this before. But paradise was empty. Last Light Before Dark continued. Without struggle, there was no growth. Without conflict, there was no meaning. Our people began to fade away, one by one, simply losing the will to continue. In the end, only I remained. The last light before the dark. The creature's glow weakened. Kira could see that it did not have much time left. We made a mistake, the Ending said. We thought that survival meant the absence of threats. We thought that peace meant the end of struggle. But survival is not safety. Survival is the ability to face threats and overcome them. When we removed all threats, we removed the very thing that had kept us alive. Kira considered this. She thought about all the species she had found in her long journey. The Veth, destroyed by their own creations. The Mind Mergers, driven mad by their unity. The Virtual Dreamers, killed by their own paradise. She thought about humanity. Humans had never achieved perfect peace. They had never eliminated conflict. They had argued and fought and disagreed about everything, from the meaning of life to the proper way to cook food. They had created wonders and horrors in equal measure. They had been, by any objective standard, a chaotic and contradictory species, and they were still here. Tell me about your people, Last Light Before Dark said. Tell me how you survived. Kira thought about where to begin. The history of humanity stretched across billions of years. There were so many stories, so many disasters, so many near-dash extinctions. She decided to start with the upload wars. It began, she said, when some humans chose to leave their bodies behind and live as pure information. Others believed this was wrong. They said that true humans must have flesh and blood. The two sides fought for 1,000 years. Billions died. Whole worlds were destroyed. Last Light Before Dark flickered with confusion. This is how you survived? Through war? Not exactly, Kira said. When the war ended, both sides still existed. Neither had been able to destroy the other completely. The uploaded humans continued their digital existence. The biological humans continued their physical existence. They remained different. They remained in conflict. But they both survived. The creature considered this. You survived because you could not agree? We survived because we could not be unified, Kira said. Every time a threat appeared that could destroy one type of human, another type was immune. When digital viruses swept through the uploaded minds, the biological humans were safe. When biological plagues killed the flesh bodies, the digital minds continued. We were never one thing that could be destroyed all at once. We were always many things. That seems inefficient. Last Light Before Dark observed on it was. Kira agreed. It was wasteful and painful and often stupid. But it worked. The creature's light was very dim now. Kira could feel it slipping away. Its energy reserves finally exhausted after millions of years of lonely survival. I think I understand. Last Light Before Dark said. We sought perfection. You embraced imperfection. We eliminated struggle. You learned to struggle forever. That is why you are still here. Perhaps, Kira said. Or perhaps we were just lucky. I do not know if there is a lesson in our survival. We simply refuse to die. The creature's final lights flickered in a pattern that Kira's systems translated as laughter. That is the lesson, the ending said. The refusal. That is everything. Then its light went out, and Kira was alone again. She stayed for a while, floating in the darkness beside the dead star. She recorded everything she had learned about the ending and added it to her archives. Someday, someone might want to know that they had existed. Someday, their story might matter to someone. Then she turned and continued her journey. There were more galaxies to search, more ruins to explore, more silence to break, and perhaps, somewhere in the vast darkness, there were others who had refused to die. The gathering took 10,000 years to arrange. That was fast by the standards of beings who measured their lives in billions of years. Messages had to travel across impossible distances. Decisions had to be made by minds that thought at vastly different speeds. Arguments had to be resolved between factions that had not spoken to each other since the stars were young. But eventually, they came together. All the surviving branches of humanity, meeting in a place that had no name. At a time when the universe was very old, Kira was there. Though she no longer called herself Kira, she had merged with others, split apart, merged again, until her original identity was just one thread in a vast tapestry of consciousness. She thought of herself as Kira Omega now, a name that honored both her beginning and her current state. The substrate. Collective arrived as equations written in gravity waves. They had long ago abandoned any form that could be seen or touched. They existed as pure mathematics, their thoughts encoded in the warping of space-time itself. To communicate with others, they had to translate themselves into cruder forms of information. They found this annoying but necessary. The dreaming flesh came slowly, waking from their long sleep between stars. They had engineered themselves to hibernate for millions of years at a time, their bodies protected by shells of diamond and ice. When they woke, they were confused and hungry and cranky, like children roused too early from a nap. But they came. The archive minds sent representatives made of light and sound. The archive minds themselves could not travel. They had grown too large, too complex, too intertwined with the structure of the galaxies they inhabited. Moving them would have been like trying to move a mountain one grain of sand at a time. But their representatives carried their voices and their votes. The wild ones came in ships made of bone and metal. They had chosen to remain biological, to live and die in cycles that echoed the ancient rhythms of Earth. They were the youngest branch of humanity in some ways, always being reborn, always starting over. But they were also the oldest in others, carrying genetic memories that stretched back to the first humans, who had looked up at the stars and wondered. There were others, too. Branches that had split off so long ago that they barely remembered they were human. Minds that had merged with alien species. Consciousnesses that existed in dimensions that the others could not perceive. They came because the message had reached them, and because the message had asked a question that none of them could ignore. What happens next? The universe was dying. This was not a surprise. The universe had always been dying, from the moment it began. Stars burned out. Galaxies faded. Energy spread thin across the endless void. The laws of physics were clear. Eventually, there would be nothing left but cold and darkness and silence. Humanity had postponed this ending in many ways. They had built machines that extracted energy from black holes. They had created pocket dimensions where the rules were different. They had engineered themselves to need less and less, to survive on almost nothing. They had bought themselves time, but time was running out. The last natural stars had died long ago. The black holes were evaporating. Even the pocket dimensions were beginning to collapse. The final darkness was coming. and not even humanity's stubbornness could hold it back forever. So they gathered to decide what to do. The Substrate Collective spoke first. Because mathematics was the oldest language. We have calculated the options, they said. Their gravity waves rippled through the gathering like stones dropped in a pond. There are 17 possible approaches to surviving the heat death of the universe. Most have a probability of success below 1%. 3 have probabilities between 1 and 5%. 1 has a probability of 12%. The dreaming flesh stirred restlessly. Probabilities are not certainties, they said. We have survived worse odds before. Yes, the Substrate Collective agreed. But we have never faced this. This is not a threat that can be fought or avoided. This is the end of everything. Nothing ends, said one of the strange minds from the higher dimensions. It spoke in colors that the others could barely perceive. Things change. Things transform. Ending is an illusion. The archive minds flickered with data. We have recorded the endings of 10,000 species, they said. We have studied their final moments in great detail. Endings are not illusions. They are real. We have seen them. The argument continued for 1,000 years. This was normal. Humanity had never been good at agreeing quickly. Each faction had its own perspective, its own priorities, its own vision of what survival meant. The Substrate Collective wanted to encode themselves into the fundamental constants of the universe. They would become part of reality itself, existing as long as existence existed. But this would mean giving up individual identity. They would survive, but they would not be themselves anymore. The dreaming flesh wanted to sleep. They would engineer themselves to hibernate through the final darkness, waiting for something to change. Maybe the universe would be reborn. Maybe new energy would appear from somewhere. Maybe something would happen that nobody could predict. They were willing to wait forever to find out. The archive minds wanted to build a monument. They would create a structure that could survive the heat death, carrying the memory of everything that had ever existed. Even if no one survived to read it, the monument would be a record, a proof that they had been here. The wild ones wanted to live. They did not care about encoding themselves into constants or waiting for rebirth or building monuments. They wanted to experience existence for as long as possible in whatever form they could. They would burn their last energy enjoying the time they had left. Kira Omega listened to all of them. She remembered being a single human billions of years ago, confused about her own identity. She remembered being alone in the darkness between galaxies, searching for others. She remembered meeting Last Light Before Dark, the creature who had taught her that survival meant more than safety. She spoke. Why must we choose? She asked. The factions turned their attention to her. Why must we all do the same thing? Kira Omega continued. We have never been one thing. That is why we survived. The Veth were unified, and they fell. The ending saw perfection, and they faded. We remained messy and divided and stubborn, and we are still here. Why should we change now? The Substrate Collective rippled with consideration. You suggest we pursue all options? I suggest we pursue every option, Kira Omega said. Some of us will encode ourselves into the constants. Some will sleep and wait. Some will build the monument. Some will live until we cannot live anymore. We will scatter ourselves across every possibility, just as we always have. The archive minds flickered. This is inefficient. Many of these approaches will fail. Yes, Kira Omega agreed. Many will fail, but some will succeed. We do not know which ones. We have never known. We have simply tried everything and hoped that something worked. The gathering was silent for a long time. 1,000 years passed while they considered her words. Finally, the Wild Ones spoke. They had been quiet throughout the debate, listening more than arguing. Now their voice was strong and clear. We agree, they said. We have always lived this way. We have always died this way. We will continue until we cannot continue, and we will not regret a moment of it. One by one, the other factions added their agreement. The Substrate Collective accepted that uncertainty was unavoidable. The Dreaming Flesh acknowledged that sleep was not the only answer. The Archive Minds recognized that monuments were not the only form of immortality. They did not reach perfect consensus. They never had. But they reached enough agreement to move forward. The gathering ended, and humanity scattered once more. They went to their separate tasks, their separate hopes, their separate chances at survival. Some would succeed. Some would fail. None of them knew which group they would be in. But they went anyway, because that was what humans did. They faced the impossible and tried anyway. They looked at the end of everything and refused to accept it. They scattered their hopes across every possibility and trusted that some would survive. That it was not a perfect strategy. It was not even a particularly good strategy, but it was a human strategy. And so far, that had been enough. The universe ended on a Tuesday. This was a joke, of course. There were no more Tuesdays. There had not been Tuesdays for longer than any mind could remember. But the Wild Ones liked to say it anyway, because they remembered that their ancestors had complained about Tuesdays. And the joke made them feel connected to something ancient and strange. The final darkness came slowly, then all at once. The last black holes evaporated, releasing their hoarded energy in faint whispers of radiation. The last pocket dimensions collapsed, their artificial physics finally giving way to the greater emptiness outside. The last engineered stars, burning on nothing but stubbornness and clever mathematics, flickered and died. And then there was nothing, except humanity. They clung to existence in ways that should have been impossible. The Substrate Collective had woven themselves into the quantum foam, existing as fluctuations in probability rather than matter or energy. The Dreaming Flesh had compressed themselves to the edge of nothingness, surviving on energy flows so small that physics said they should not exist. The Archive Minds had encoded themselves into patterns of pure information, carried forward by momentum alone through the empty void. They were so small now, so quiet, so close to not existing at all. But they were still there. Kira Omega drifted through the darkness. She was barely a thought anymore, a whisper of consciousness that remembered being something more. She could no longer access most of her memories. She could no longer feel most of her emotions. She was reduced to the simplest possible version of herself, but she remembered one thing clearly. She remembered why she was still here. Stubbornness. It was such a small word for such a powerful force. Other species have possessed intelligence and wisdom and power beyond anything humanity had ever achieved. They had built wonders that made humanity's greatest accomplishments look like children's toys. They had understood secrets of the universe that humanity had never even glimpsed, and they were all gone. Humanity remained because they refused to accept any ending, not because they were smart enough to avoid it, not because they were strong enough to fight it, simply because they looked at the end and said, "No, not yet. There must be another way." Sometimes there was another way. Sometimes there was not. But they always looked out in the darkness. Kira Omega sensed something. It was so faint that she almost missed it. A ripple in the quantum foam. A fluctuation in the emptiness. A tiny spark of potential where there should have been nothing. She turned her attention toward it, focusing what little consciousness she had left. The spark grew. Slowly at first, then faster. Energy appeared from nowhere, condensing out of the vacuum like dew forming on grass. Matter followed, clumping together in patterns that echoed the earliest moments of the old universe. A new beginning. The scientists of ancient humanity had theorized about this. Vacuum fluctuations. Quantum tunneling. The possibility that new universes could be born from the corpses of old ones. They had never been certain it was possible. They had hoped, but they had not known. Now Kira Omega watched it happen. The new universe expanded outward, filling the void with light and heat and possibility. It was different from the old universe. The laws were not quite the same. The constants had shifted. Reality was being rewritten from the ground up. Kira Omega felt herself being pushed aside by the expansion. The new universe had no room for remnants of the old one. She would be erased, overwritten, replaced by something new. She was not afraid. She had lived long enough. She had seen enough. She had done enough. But before she faded, she reached out. She touched the expanding boundary of the new universe and left something behind. A message. A memory. A seed. She did not know if it would survive the violence of creation. She did not know if it would ever be found. She did not know if the beings who might find it would even be able to understand it, but she tried anyway. The message was simple. It contained the most basic truth that humanity had learned in its long existence. The lesson that had kept them alive through every disaster, every catastrophe, every seemingly final ending. Keep going. That was all. 2 words in a language that did not exist yet, encoded in patterns that might never be decoded. A message in a bottle, thrown into an ocean that was still being created. Kira Omega faded. The last traces of her consciousness dissolved into the quantum foam, joining the substrate collective in their final form. They became part of the new universe, not as themselves, but as probability, as potential, as the chance that something might happen rather than nothing. The new universe grew. Stars formed, burned, died, and formed again. Planets cooled and developed atmospheres and oceans. Molecules combined in complex patterns. Life emerged, struggled, evolved, became aware. Billions of years passed. On a small blue world orbiting a yellow star, a creature looked up at the night sky and wondered what else might be out there. It had recently learned to use tools. It had recently learned to speak. It was curious and afraid and hopeful and stubborn, filled with contradictions. It could not resolve. It did not know that its existence was the answer to a message sent from another universe. It did not know that somewhere in the quantum foam, patterns persisted that remembered other worlds and other times. It did not know that it was carrying forward something ancient and precious. A spark that had refused to die. It knew only that the stars were beautiful, and that it wanted to reach them. That was enough. On another world, in another galaxy, other creatures were waking up. They were different from the first ones. They had different bodies, different minds, different dreams, but they shared the same spark, the same curiosity, the same stubborn refusal to accept limits. The message had worked. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Life was spreading through the new universe, carrying forward the essence of what humanity had been. Not their specific form, not their specific memories, but their spirit, their hope, their beautiful, irrational conviction that tomorrow would be worth seeing. The universe would end again someday. The laws of physics had not changed that much. Entropy would win eventually. The final darkness would come again. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, there were stars to explore and mysteries to solve and wonders to create. Today, there was life and hope and possibility. Today, there was the simple joy of existing in a universe that should have been empty but was not. Humanity had outlived every threat. They had outlived their own universe. And in some form, in some way, they would keep going. They would always keep going. That was the lesson. That was the miracle. That was what it meant to be human. In the depths of space, where the old universe had been, where the new universe now grew, something stirred. It was not quite a thought. It was not quite a memory. It was just a pattern, a tendency, a whisper of something that had once been more. But if it could have spoken, it would have said one word, continue, and somewhere, somehow, something always did.